Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the Iqra Book Festival, a unique project started by the Art and Radio Ramadan 365 here in Glasgow, but broadcasting around the world. I believe we have quite a few people who have registered for the event. Over 250 odd people have registered for the event. So I hope you've been enjoying the sessions so far. If you have just joined us, you've missed some wonderful sessions. Everything from soldiers to spies, and we continue in that war theme with Dr. Ghee Bowman, talking about his books and the importance about the forgotten Muslim soldiers of Dunkirk. I think many of us will have seen the harrowing film actually about Dunkirk, etc., and now know a little bit more about that, but won't know anything about. There was very little representation, I think, from ethnic minorities in that film. Just before I do that, just to mention that today's been brought to you with the kind sponsorship of Al Khair Foundation and of Human Relief Foundation as well. So thank you very much to them for sponsoring this event and making it possible. And if you've enjoyed it today, please head across to their websites and donate for their phenomenal charity work that they do all around the world, and to make the world a better place. And so far, that's what the sessions have been about. It's been about that positivity, about that inclusiveness, about those individuals who inspire us to be better individuals, and to be better people, and to bring the world together, which is something we need more of in this day and age, rather than divisiveness we hear from many of our politicians. I'm going to introduce our next interviewer. We'll be interviewing Dr. Ghee Bowman, Raisa Ahmed, and we could probably do interviews with the people who are doing interviews, the fascinating people in themselves. We'll maybe do that sometime maybe Ramadan. Raisa Ahmed is a Scottish Asian Muslim screenwriter and director. She's based in Glasgow. I've had a good fortune to meet her. She works across television and film. Her credits include BBC shows Feeling Better and Molly Mac Control, a BBC social phone drama, and Meet by the Water, a Scottish Film Talent Network commissioned short film, and the BBC's The Break, and upcoming BBC teen monologues Sparks. So she's really busy, a busy woman. So thank you very much for taking time out today, Raisa. She's currently in development on a feature film project with Film 4, as well as developing a number of other projects across film and television, so very much embedded in the media, and a good role model for young, aspiring people who want to be involved in the media. Thank you very much for joining us today, Raisa. Assalamu alaikum, and I'll hand over to you to interview Dr. Ghee Bowman.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us while we speak to Dr. Ghee Bowman. I'm quite excited about this because I think that as a community, we've got a lot of stories that haven't been told, and what Dr. Ghee Bowman's doing with his book is he's telling some of those stories. So Dr. Bowman, Ghee, shall we start with a little reading, and then we can quiz you on where these stories came from and so on?
Sure thing, absolutely, yes. Good morning, Raisa, nice to see you. So I'm going to read to you from the prologue to the book. And the prologue is called On the Beach. So it starts, Bray Dunes, Tuesday, the 28th of May, 1940, the northernmost point of France, just a few miles from Belgium and 50 miles from the southeast corner of England. This pretty seaside resort with its restaurants, striped canopies and miles of golden sands has been transformed by an accident of history into a Dantean vision of hell. A vast plume of black smoke rises from the burning oil refinery in the harbour to the left. Smell is everywhere. In front, the sea is littered with wrecks and burning ships, while small boats nip back and forth to the sands. On the beach, tired, despondent Tommies in their khaki battle dress and tin helmets line up patiently to board a boat that will take them to home, a square meal and a quiet bed. Overhead is the occasional Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, or worst of all, a Stuka, with its deafening, frightful Jericho trumpet siren fitted deliberately to cause panic, diving down nearly vertically to drop its 250-kilogram bomb on the dunes. And behind, very few miles behind, the might of the German army is closing in, harassing the French and British rearguard, besieging the city of Lille, advancing in a seemingly endless victorious wave through Belgium and northern France. This is the Battle of Dunkirk, third day of Operation Dynamo, the 9 days wonder that will see 338,000 Allied troops evacuated from under the noses of the Germans. 18,000 men will be evacuated on this day, 6,000 from the beaches to the east of the town and 12,000 from the harbour. The myth of Dunkirk has many elements, one of which I shall skip on a bit. Among the men evacuated from the beaches that night were 300 who looked very different from their boatmates. Dressed in khaki, yes, but a long shirt like kurta rather than a short battle dress blouse. Some wore the standard tin helmets on their head, some wore forage caps, and some wore a pugri or turban. All had nut brown faces, most had moustaches, all but 4 of them were Muslims. They carried no weapons, for they had been issued with none when they left far off Punjab 6 months before. These were the men of the 25th Animal Transport Company of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, who had travelled 7,000 miles with their mules to help the British Army. They were part of the so-called Force K6, also known as the Indian Contingent. They marched along the beach on the afternoon of May the 28th, sepoys and drivers, Naiks and Dafadars, blacksmiths and carpenters and cooks, and one imam. One of them was Jamadan Nizamdin, who would stay with them all the way through until their return to India in February 1944, rising through the ranks until he obtained a commission as lieutenant. His image and his voice are preserved forever in a cine clip at the Imperial War Museum, filmed on the day he reached India again after more than 4 years away from home. Bellows boy Mehtab Khan was there on the 28th of May, a man whose job was to blow air to superheat the fire that forged shoes for the mules. Beside his job, he had a talent for hockey that he would put into use playing against the youth club in Devon a year later. At their head was the magnificent figure of Major Muhammad Akbar Khan, at that time the senior-most Indian in the Indian Army. A veteran of the First World War who joined the army as a humble sepoy, he towered over his soldiers, being 6 foot 2 inches tall and broad to boot. He had been one of the first Indians to be made an officer in 1919, and he would go on to be the senior officer in the new Pakistan Army in 1947, eventually dying in 1986 in his house Lal Koti in Karachi, surrounded by his loving family. The 4-year story of the men of the 25th Company and their comrades is one of the great untold stories of the war. Their friendships and the racism they encountered, their struggles to find the right kind of food, the mosques they attended and improvised, the women they loved and the babies they left behind were all part of a unique experience of soldiering. They included in their number the only units of the Indian Army ever sent to Britain, and therefore they mirrored the experience of hundreds of thousands of British soldiers who had travelled in the opposite direction. They spent time in some obscure corners of the British Isles, Kinlochleven, Steepholm, Meavy Bridge, Nuntmore, and they formed some strong bonds with farmers and children and women throughout. The men of 22nd Company, however, didn't make it to the UK until the very end of the war, having been captured in France in June 1940 and spending nearly 5 years in prisoner of war camps. They left behind 58 of their friends in cemeteries in Britain, France, and Germany, men who were bombed by the Luftwaffe, suffered from accidents, or died from tuberculosis. Their stories shall be told in this book. So that's a bit of the prologue of the book.
I got goosebumps while you were reading part of that. When you started talking about them leaving home, I could feel goosebumps. And it's that thing of these are almost ghosts in our past that have not had a chance to tell their stories yet. And I guess the first question is about starting at the start. What inspired you to start looking into this kind of specific part of history? I mean, there's so much that's untold. What drew you to this?
Let me show you a slide. There it is. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to show you this slide here. So this comes from a book. About 8 years ago, I was doing a project. I live in Exeter in Devon, a long way from you folk up in Glasgow. I was doing a project about the multicultural history of the city of Exeter. And I was looking at a book about the Second World War in Devon. And I came across these 3 photos, which says that these were guys in Modbury, which is a village on the south coast of Devon, in 1940. And I was just fascinated by this. And I looked at these photos with the mules and with the turbans and going along the country lanes, and it looks like they're on the beach. And I thought, what is this story? How, where did this come from? I thought I knew about the Second World War, but I'd never heard of this, Indian soldiers being here in Britain, in Devon even. And so I went to the National Archives, and as Sharmi Basu was saying, and finding some of the wonderful records they had there, and I found the war diary of the 25th Company that I was just telling you about, I was reading to you about. And it was just such a fascinating story. And it progressed from there. After I finished that job, I went on to do a master's at Exeter University and then a PhD at Exeter University, and that led to the book. So for me, it was just a fascination of a great story, but a story that was, as you say, a story that was untold. Ghosts, as you say.
Yeah, and how did you then go about doing that research? I mean, you've spoken a little bit about finding that diary, finding the pictures, but I guess when you're looking that far in the past, our primary resources are often gone. So how did you go about doing that? Were you traveling to India and Pakistan? Were you speaking to families? Were there any issues in terms of the language barriers and all of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was a detective job, I mean, starting in the National Archive and going to the main archives in the UK, but also going to some quite obscure parts of Scotland particularly, but also Wales and England, and going to little museums and talking to people who remembered them. And there are still quite a few people around who remember them. I went to France, I went to Germany, looked in archives there, looked in cemeteries. I've visited all but one of the 58 graves that are left behind in Europe. And I went to India and I went to Pakistan, which was fantastic for finding documents, but also particularly in Pakistan, I went to some very small villages in Punjab, and I met family members. I mean, I was hoping that I might still find one of them still alive, but I didn't do that. I wasn't successful in that. But I met lots of daughters and nephews and great nephews, and some of them, a lot of them had very didn't have much to say. They didn't have much that they remembered about their relatives. In many cases, that they didn't actually know them. In some cases, they had some artifacts and things that they could show me. So, for example, those who'd been in prisoner of war camps, one of them had a wonderful Quran stand that her father had made while he was in the camp, or they had money from Germany. And the best interview was a lovely lady who was in a, I can't remember the name of the village, who had a book of poems that her father had written in Punjabi, which was just fantastic, which was about his time in Britain and also his time in Burma as well afterwards, later in the war. So there was, it's like a kind of a scattering of pieces of evidence around the world. And I had to try and, track them down a bit like a detective does.
And did you find that any bits of evidence were conflicting with each other? Because, our histories can be often told through one lens.
Absolutely.
And were there any instances where you were just quite not sure what the truth was?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question, Raisa. Thank you for that. I mean, yes, and absolutely the bit that I was reading just now. So Major Muhammad Akbar Khan, he wrote a memoir which covered that period. And he also told stories to his family about that period. And then there is the official war diary, which was written by one of the white officers in his unit, the commanding officer in his unit. And they don't add up. They don't quite match in terms of detail of dates, but also who was actually in charge of that company. When you read Major Muhammad Akbar Khan's account, he was in charge of the company. But when you read the Major Wainwright, his name was, he was the commanding officer, and that's what all the kind of official documents tell you. And there was a story that Major Muhammad Akbar Khan had told his nephew and nieces, a wonderful story about Dunkirk, which was not true. I mean, completely untrue. There's nothing that validates it. So I mean, you have to be, you have to be really quite careful in terms of triangulating, I suppose, triangulating evidence and sifting and then presenting only that which is, which is verified and verifiable.
Yeah, I mean, it's some task, isn't it? It's gathering all of that, putting it all together. And your book, what you've done is you focused in specifically on individuals as a way to tell those stories. I mean, how did you decide who were those men that you were going to focus in on? And were there any stories that you just, you came across and you just knew straight away that this had to be part of the book?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, I'm a social and cultural historian, so I like people. It's all about people, and it's all about individuals. So, I mean, one of the things that I did in the preparation and the research was to gather all the names that I could. So there were 4,100 and something men in Force K6. I found the names of 2,200 of them, so more than half. Wow. And I've got all of those on a database. And every time I found another piece of evidence, I'd put that into the database, and so it would build up and up. And in most cases, there's much more stuff from and about the officers, so the British officers and the Indian officers. So, I mean, Major Muhammad Akbar Khan, for example, I could write a book about him. And the other Indian officer at the beginning of the war, Captain Anis Ahmed Khan, I could write a book about him. And I met his daughter and had a great interview with her. I think, can I tell you a little story?
Yes, please do.
So I'm going to just zoom through some of these slides and show you this slide here. This is Jeff Shapland, okay, who's a gentleman in his 70s who lives in Leicester, near Leicester in England. And his mother is Gladys, and his father, who is his father? Well, this is one of the great mysteries that of him and of the book. So he was born in St Austell in Cornwall in 1942, and the photo on the left shows some men of the Indian Contingent marching through the streets of St Austell in 1940, and he was born a few months after that, about a year after that, and he grew up. He's on the right in the photo here with his brother Ron. He grew up thinking that his mother was Gladys, who we saw in the first photo, and that his father was a white English electrician by the name of Shapland, who was in Plymouth for most of the war, who was married to his mother. And maybe in that photo you can tell, maybe you can't, but that wasn't who his father was. His father was one of the guys in the photo on the left. Probably through some detective work that he did, his father was a guy called Jamal Khan, who was a driver, so the lowest rank in the 25th Company again. And Jeff, or as he's now known, Paritosh, he spent many, many years with this idea that his father was a white guy. And it was only as his life progressed, going away from Cornwall, studying in Yorkshire, working in Bristol, and then in Leicestershire, people would say things to him like, he was a teacher for many, many years, and the school kids would come up to him and say, Asian school kids in Leicestershire would come up to him and say, Mr. Shapland, are you Asian too? And he'd say, no, not at all. And he experienced racism, and even though he thought he would not be the subject of racism, and eventually he put together clues, and he found that actually it was a bit of an open secret among some members of his family. And I tell the story in more detail in the book. What's interesting about that story is the shame that his mother felt, the shame that she felt in that she never told him who his father was, and indeed his brother Ron in the same photo, never told them who their father was, and yet he is completely comfortable with that. He is comfortable with his identity, with that his father is this unknown person who loved his mother and with whom had two children with his mother, and who went to India and then almost certainly to Pakistan after partition in 1947, and never saw him again. But he's comfortable with that, and I find that very inspiring, really, as a story for our time.
I mean, how many of those stories must there be? That's there must be endless. There must be people out there that don't realise that that's their heritage as well.
Exactly. I mean, there's at least 8 that I know of, children, K6 babies, I call them, who were in Scotland. Sorry, not in Scotland, in Wales and in Cornwall. There are. I bet you there are some in Scotland. I haven't come across it yet.
I mean, that one of the questions we have from those listening in is, have you found any surviving relatives of forced K6 relating to the soldiers buried in Kingussie in Scotland?
Yes. I interviewed two guys in Pakistan who were related to the Kingussie burials. Absolutely, yeah. And that was that was quite powerful, actually, because when I met them, I was able to show them the photos of the graves. So I'll just there you are. That's a photo of the Kingussie cemetery. So this is a place in, for those of you who don't know, it's in the north of Scotland, in the Highlands. You can see the mountains behind. This photo shows a ceremony that was organised by Colourful Heritage that I went to a couple of years ago. The 2 men in the middle of the photo are chaplains. One is the Muslim imam for the British Armed Forces. The other one is a Church of Scotland chaplain. And there are 9 men from 4th K6 who are buried there. And I was able to show the relatives back in Pakistan. I was able to show them the photos of the graves, and they'd never seen the photos. They'd never seen the graves before. They didn't know where they were buried. They had no idea of where Kingussie was, and even probably where Scotland was. And they were really quite moved by that. And they were quite, in some cases, in tears, and really pleased to see that these stones are looked after and cared for. And story behind the care is also a great story. So in the photo on the right, there's a lady called Isabel Harling, and she is in her 90s, and since 1948, if I remember rightly, she has been looking after those stones. She has been going regularly and cleaning and tidying and putting flowers on, as a member of the British Legion, a member of the local part of the British Legion. And this year she was honoured by getting being awarded the British Empire Medal for her service. And I think that's a fantastic testimony and a fantastic way of linking between South Asia and Scotland. And
so does she remember the men? And are there people within that area that still remember the men that are buried there?
She doesn't personally remember them. There are certainly people up in the north of Scotland who remember them. Yeah, I met quite a few who did further north than that, in Leg and in other villages in the north of Scotland. Yeah, there are still people who remember them, and some great stories to know.
Any you can share? Any funny ones?
I would just say Yaqub Mirza was one of the soldiers, and he was posted to the village of Knockdhu, which is up at the top end of it's at Speyside, and his unit was actually posted in the distillery. They were put in the distillery where the whiskey is made, because all the whiskey distilleries were shut down for the duration of the war. And while he was there, he was. I haven't got the photo on the slideshow actually, unfortunately, but he was a very handsome young man, and he went to a dance in a local village, and he saw a young woman there, and basically he fell in love with her, and they had a friendship, and that friendship was continued afterwards, when many years later he came back to Britain, and he settled in Nottingham, and he died there not very many years ago, and he was reunited with this girl that he'd met while he was in Scotland. Even though both of them were now married with children, they were reunited as adults, and it's a great story. It's a lovely story. I haven't really got the time to go into detail.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing, and it kind of speaks to how far-reaching some of these roots are, and how integrated and I guess intertwined is the better word, all these communities are, in a way that in modern Britain we can often not realise that we've all been part of very similar experiences for a very long time. I mean, one of the questions, we've got a couple of really good questions here actually. So the first one is, what implications does your research have on modern contemporary issues? So for example, with our young people and their identity and what they're facing, especially I guess with a lot of the movements that are happening now around calling out racism, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of that, and there's more of a challenging of versions of history that we've been told. How does your research kind of help that, or how does it impact that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I think history needs to be retold and re-examined and rediscovered. And the history of the Second World War needs that as much as any other part of history, because the Second World War is still very alive in people's memories in the UK. Certainly for white British people, it is. And what I'm saying is that, and I think what Colourful Heritage is saying is that it needs to be alive for people of South Asian heritage as well. But I think it's also, I could talk about Islamophobia, and I could talk about the sort of racism that exists in Britain, and it has existed. But in a way, I'd rather flip it round and talk about these guys, these soldiers, and the people they met, and the people that they fell in love with, and the people they worked alongside, and the relationships they made. I'm just wondering if there's a good photos here. That's a nice photo. This is actually from France rather than from Britain. But I think I'd rather talk about them as being an example of how you can get along and how you can work together. In this case, they're watching a gymkhana in northern France, and they're watching guys doing trick riding, and they're watching music and dancing, and it's it's a great photo. I love this photo so much from the Imperial War Museum. So, for me, it's about people getting on with it and being part of something better, and getting past those differences of language, ethnicity, religion, nation, and seeing, that we are together just like they are together. I mean, in those days there was a common enemy, and that makes it easier, I think. And they were fighting against fascism, as Shrabani Basit was saying before, with Noor Inayat Khan. I would say we have a common enemy, which is about division, what we're trying to do. And I think what I aim to do is to help to build a multicultural society where all strands of our history are recognized and brought together and celebrated and remembered, and where we can get over those divisions, which I think the divisions are put there by people who want to divide us, but we don't have to be divided. We shouldn't be divided. We can be part of something bigger and better. I think just an example right now is that Marcus Rashford is empowering and encouraging and inspiring people around the country to get together and work as a community, and to offer food for children who may be hungry over the half-term period. And that's what it's about. It's about people coming together and working together. And I think that's what their story, one of the things that their story is about.
I mean, and I think that's absolutely what this history should be doing. It should be inspiring people to see the way in which actually we have been together in the past. I mean, have you had anyone from, I guess you would call it the far right, who might find some of what you're presenting quite challenging, or might actually just not want to believe it? Have you ever had any backlash like that, or?
No,
that's great.
Right? So I haven't. I mean,
that's brilliant.
I think there's something. I mean, I think that Shrabani had a question like that as well, but I think there's something about the fact of this being part of the war effort that kind of takes the rug from under the feet of those who might kind of push that line. I mean, there's another story in the book about Bernard Manning, who is a racist comedian in the north of England, who said some racist things. But I think I don't want to dwell on those two guys too much. You know, they kind of, I think they disappear into the background. I truly believe we're creating a better society in Britain at the moment. You know, you can get bogged down in culture wars on Twitter, but you can also see that there's a lot of good stuff that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that I'm really pleased to hear that you're not getting that backlash that we would think that you might get, because of what you're presenting, essentially a new version of a history that people think they understand in one way. So, I mean, we've got this book. The book is out. And do you see yourself doing something more with all the research that you've done? Is there another book that goes alongside this, or are there other areas that you've kind of uncovered during your research that you're just like, right now I want to get my teeth into this?
Yeah, there's a website, forcek6.org.uk, which includes, among other things, it includes the database of all the names that I've found. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that. I feel like, I don't know, it feels like this project hasn't finished. So, I mean, I am doing other things. I'm doing bits and pieces of writing and research and educational materials and so on, but it just feels as if there's more to come out. I mean, I had a letter a few weeks ago from a woman in Wales saying that she remembered them, that she'd read the book, that she was really, really pleased about it. And she sent me some photos, which I hadn't seen before, and a letter that had come back, 2 letters that had come back from India to her parents or her grandparents, I can't remember. And so there's still evidence out there. There's still things out there. So I will move on, and I will have to move on. But I think it's still a live subject for me. So, I'm hoping that there may be a film someday. I'm hoping that there will be a South Asian edition. I think it's quite possible, of the book. It feels like it's still a live project. Right?
I mean, some of the comments that we've had, do you see this becoming a movie adaptation? And then I could see a great TV drama about Scottish Highlanders of that time dealing with curry and chapatis. So there's clearly an appetite there for this.
Yeah. Well, there's one story from Aberdeen about which was on the BBC website, about a guy who tasted curry and chapatis, literally chapatis and curry, and who said that it influenced his taste buds for the positive for the rest of his life. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the potential of a film is great. There's a lot of interesting visual stuff in here. I mean, I won't show you that, but what else? I quite like this, actually. This is a poster that was produced, Waterloo Station, 1943. Helen McKee was a famous artist, reasonably famous illustrator. So this is in the middle of the war, Waterloo Station, one of the principal railway stations in the capital. And you can actually go and you can get exactly that view. You can go upstairs where the shops are and you can still see that same view. Here's the hustle and bustle, and here's a pair of nuns, and here's an American soldier and a policeman and some naval guys. And what do we have right there in the middle? Here's a close-up. Here are these 2 guys from Force K6 with their puggies and their rifles. And the reason that they are there in the photo is because they were there on Waterloo Station. I mean, they used to go to the mosque at Woking, the first purpose-built mosque in the UK. They used to go to that mosque very often, and Woking is just 20 miles down the railway line from Waterloo. So there they are, and she put them in that poster, and that picture is very popular as a jigsaw puzzle. So if you go to the national, the British London Transport Museum in Covent Garden, there is a jigsaw puzzle that you can buy there, and these 2 guys are right there in the middle of it, and lots of people buy the puzzle. And I find that really fascinating, that they are there in that middle of that poster and in the middle of that jigsaw puzzle, and have been there since 1943. At the heart of this great railway station with the steam trains all around them, and yet they're kind of not noticed. They're kind of hiding in plain sight. They're just part of this enormous hustle and bustle, and the life of wartime Britain. 2 out of probably hundreds of figures. And I find that it's a great metaphor really for them being hidden in plain sight. And also I love the idea of the jigsaw. In a way that kind of reflects my research process, finding pieces of jigsaw, you know, in London, in Scotland, in France and Germany and in Pakistan, and bringing them all together and assembling the jigsaw piece by piece.
I mean, it does feel like it is that simple, isn't it? It's, you know, she's clearly put thought into ensuring that they're included. So she very much sees them as a part of this time. And with some of these kind of, I guess, films and so on that we have, sometimes the inclusion of those stories is that simple. It's just ensuring that they are included in that way. And it doesn't, you don't need to make a big thing of it. It's just, you know, that's the truth. They were there.
Absolutely, they were there. There wasn't very many of them, but they were there, and they were, you know, they were photographed. They were. There's some film footage, you know, I could show you. There's lots of, you know, there's an advert for Sunlight soap, which featured, you know, an Indian soldier, which was based on them. You know, many ways that they were kind of visible in society at that time until they left in 44.
Great.
Thank you so much, and Raisa, I'm going to have to try and wrap it up here. If you want to just last words from you, Raisa.
No, I just want to say thank you so much for all of that. That was absolutely fascinating. I feel like we could go on for 2 hours talking about this. So everyone, please do check out the book. We will share the links and go discover some hidden histories. Thank you.
Thanks, Raisa.
Great, thank you very much, Ghee. And I don't know if you want to just say one last message, Ghee, to the young people out there actually about how important these messages are of the past, because of, you know, my generation, of course, we kind of you know, talked about and previous generations knew about the world wars, etc. And as each generation goes by, I think it starts to become more and more diluted. You know, what is so important about our past that will shape the future of young people?
Well, I would say that, I mean, history evolves and our understanding of history evolves. And I think what we need to do with the Second World War is for young people and for all of us to understand that it was much bigger and more complicated and more diverse than we are usually, what we are usually fed. It wasn't just, you know, American soldiers and British soldiers and German soldiers. That every country in the world was involved in some way, and most countries, you know, were actually on one side or another fighting, and you know, and that kind of breadth is largely unknown. So, if you are a young Briton, a young child in a Scottish school, and your heritage is from Brazil, or your heritage is from Africa, or your heritage is from Eastern Europe, then there is a link for you there. There is something, there's a connection between your country of origin and this country in terms of the Second World War. So kind of, you know, find that if you can. There is stuff available, and I will, you know, and yes, just to understand the breadth of that involvement and of that contribution to the war.
We've posted up some links so far about some stuff. I managed to find a link to the jigsaw puzzle as well, so you can pick up stuff from the Transport Museum. It's absolutely wonderful, and I absolutely love that image of the Indian soldiers sitting cross-legged with, you know, local children sitting on their laps. Is absolutely phenomenal. I think we have to do probably some sort of. It'd be great to do some exhibition of that kind going around the country. Would be fantastic. Thank you so much, Ghee, for that and for your passion and for what you've done and the books, etc. We hope that it does go from strength to strength, and we perhaps see some other form of that in some media and otherwise. But thank you for bringing that into our lives, and I hope more and more people begin to learn lessons from these modest soldiers in space light. We have to move on.
Thank you, Shukriya.
For your time. Take care. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
That was Dr. Ghee Bowman talking about his research into the K6 force, fighting force, and their influence, both in Dunkirk and, of course, in Scotland here, where they were ready to fight in World War II. Time is coming up to 12:30. We're going to move on to our next session, and my session ends. We'll come back after a word from our sponsors, and I'll introduce our next co-host, Maria Sharif.